When the United States and Israel began their military campaign against the Islamic regime, the Iranian people were cheering. They were happy, they were thankful. This whole moderate versus hardliner narrative is actually something that the Islamic regime itself created as a way to keep the system in place. And you have to look at what His Royal Highness Reza Pahlavi is saying. He's not saying that he's coming back as the Shah. He's saying that he's coming back as a transitional leader, someone who can transition the country from a totalitarian Islamic dictatorship to a functioning, secular, modern, democratic society. I think everyone should have a vested interest in freeing Iran, because a free Iran is good not only for the Iranian people, but it's also good for the rest of the world.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm delighted today to be joined down the line by Goldie Ghamari, a former member of the provincial parliament in Ontario, a lawyer and a human rights advocate. Goldie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Goldie, you're from Iran. You've got a lot of connections to Iran. You've been fighting for Iranian freedom from Canada for many years. I just wondered if you could give us a sense of how people's feelings may have changed or may not have changed over the course of this war. I'd imagine a lot of people that you're in contact with would have been quite hopeful at the start of things, but how are they feeling now that things have got bogged down in negotiations? There's this sort of ceasefire, and Trump is quite eager to do a deal while leaving a lot of the regime intact.
Yeah, I mean, people ultimately, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about Iran as occupied Iran, the same way that France was occupied by Nazi Germany in World War II. So when you look at Iran within that sort of context, then what I'm about to say is going to make sense, because when the United States and Israel began their military campaign against the Islamic regime, the Iranian people were cheering. They were happy, they were thankful, not just outside of occupied Iran, but in Iran. Some of the initial footages that we were receiving was people dancing in the streets and honking their horns. And of course, when we got the news that Khamenei, who was the supreme dictator of the Islamic regime, when we got news that he was exterminated right away on February 28th, well, I mean, people were out cheering, celebrating, fireworks were being, shot into the air. So the Iranian people really see this as a liberation movement, humanitarian intervention. And so now that the ceasefire has kind of been going on and the negotiations been going on for a while, Iranian people are not really happy about that, because the one thing that we know, after dealing with a brutal totalitarian dictatorship, is that you can't negotiate with terrorists. If their lips are moving, they're lying.
Yeah, that brings me on to my next question, really. I mean, we have tried these negotiations before. The US has been, negotiating in some form or other with Iran or with the Islamic Republic, I should say, for decades. We hear a lot about that the idea that there might be some moderates within the regime that you can do business with. Is that true, or is that just wishful thinking on America's part?
So it's not true at all. There are actually no moderates within the Islamic regime. There's no such thing as a moderate Nazi. There's no such thing as a moderate terrorist. This whole moderate versus hardliner narrative is actually something that the Islamic regime itself created as a way to keep the system in place, because the whole tactic and strategy of the so-called moderates is to present a more um, you know moderate uh, perspective, and a more moderate appearance. But they're parts of the system, and they're just as evil. In fact, I would say that the so-called moderates are even more dangerous than the ones that are just crazy out in the open, because the crazy ones will, stab you in the chest. The moderates will shake your hand, and then as soon as you turn your back, they'll stab you in the back. So, no, there are no moderates. It's just a tactic that the Islamic regime has been using to keep control and to basically maintain power.
And what has happened to the protest movement? Obviously, people were very inspired, I think, by the uprisings in January and towards the end of last year, horrified by the executions of those brave protesters. I think a lot of people were hoping that they would use the war or the cover of the war to rise up against the regime. Are they biding their time, or is this, or have things petered out in a more serious way?
No, people are definitely biding their time. If anything, there's even more anger than before, and there's even more determination than before because, after the horrible massacre back on January 8 and 9, the number right now is minimum 40,000. We actually think it's much higher than that because we're talking about a nationwide protest that was happening simultaneously across 30 different cities in the country. So when you do the math, 40,000, it's very easily attainable, unfortunately, by the Islamic regime because they were using military equipment and anti-aircraft missiles and anti-aircraft like bullets against innocent, unarmed Iranians. So right now there is, as His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi says, there's an ocean of blood between the Iranian people and the Islamic regime. And the only reason that the Iranian people haven't risen up yet is because the conditions are not ripe. Iranians already demonstrated back in January that we are willing to rise up and fight, and we don't want this Islamic dictatorship. However, when a population is unarmed and you're dealing with literal lunatics who think that they have the Allah-given right to murder infidels in the name of Islam and jihad, um, it's difficult for Iranian people to rise up. But I would say people are more determined than ever. We're basically just waiting for the call of His Royal Highness Reza Pahlavi, who's not only the Crown Prince of Iran, but he's also the leader of the Lion and Sun Revolution.
And I wanted to ask a little bit about Reza Pahlavi. We've had previous guests on this show who have said that actually that they don't respect his leadership, or they're slightly wary of returning or transitioning from a dictatorship to a monarchy. They don't think that that's democratic enough. Why do you see things differently?
I live in Canada. Canada has a monarchy as well, and we're also a democracy. So prior to 1979, Iran was actually a constitutional monarchy, just like the UK, just like Canada, just like various other countries. In fact, Iran became a constitutional monarchy in 1906 during the Persian Constitutional Revolution. So, as of 1906, Iranians have had the right to vote and we've had a parliament. So anyone who claims that prior to 1979 Iran was a dictatorship, they're either lying or they don't know what they're talking about. In fact, the Shah of Iran at the time in 1963 gave Iranian women the right to vote before many countries in Europe gave women the right to vote. It was actually that moment when the Shah of Iran was modernizing Iran and gave Iranian women the right to vote that, in fact, triggered the Islamists and the communists at the time who were in line with the Islamists. And that eventually led to the 1979 Islamic coup d'etat. You also have to remember that back in the 70s, all the way before that, Iran at the time bordered the USSR. So the USSR, the Soviets were constantly trying to bring Iran under the Iron Curtain the way they had done with all of the other countries. The Shah of Iran was essentially the dam that was preventing that. And so that's the reason why communism was banned in Iran prior to 1979, because that was basically the Soviets trying to infiltrate. First of all, that's the history of, very, very brief history of the country prior to 1979. And the reality is that anyone who has an opinion, um, it's irrelevant because ultimately the Iranian people made their choice. They made their choice back on January 8 and 9, where over 40,000 innocent people were murdered. But aside from that, again, you have to look at what His Royal Highness Reza Pahlavi is saying. He's not saying that he's coming back as the Shah. He's saying that he's coming back as a transitional leader, someone who can transition the country from a totalitarian Islamic dictatorship to a functioning, secular, modern democratic society. Now, what form of democratic society that's going to be up to the people to determine in a referendum. So, whether the Iranian people want to have a republic like the United States, or if they want to have a constitutional monarchy like the UK, that's going to be ultimately the choice of the Iranian people to determine at the ballot box. But right now, all of us, regardless of whether we want a constitutional monarchy or a republic, we're all united behind His Royal Highness Reza Pahlavi because he is the only person that we trust to transition the country. There's no one else right now. And in fact, anyone who at this moment is attacking Reza Pahlavi is pretty much on the same side of the Islamic regime because the Islamic regime is the one who's attacking him because they know that he is a threat to their system.
And do you think the people in the West have any kind of understanding or even begin to understand what it means to live under a dictatorship like the Islamic Republic?
No. It's I would say the only people in the West who truly understand what it's like to live in occupied Iran are those who have escaped from other dictatorships or from communist countries as well. Um, there are a lot of, Eastern European people who are very sympathetic to the Iranian cause because they have experienced living in a communist state. Venezuelans, Cubans, even Chinese people, anyone who's pretty much has that lived experience knows what it's like. If you are born inside of occupied Iran, that's basically a death sentence because you can be murdered at any time for any reason, with no, uh, no justice, right? Um, People's lives mean nothing. The Islamic regime views Iranians as just a tool, right? You want to talk about an open air prison? Iran is the largest open air prison in the Middle East right now. 90 million Iranians are being held hostage. I mean, what what government actually shuts down the internet during wartime to prevent its population from communicating with one another because the government wants to maximize civilian casualties? That's the sort of government we're dealing with. I mean, I could go on and on with even, more horrific examples like, I'll just give one, very horrific example. Um, Before the Islamic regime executes women, they rape them. And the reason they rape them is to make sure that their souls don't go to heaven because apparently virgins go to heaven. So every single woman, doesn't matter her age, could be a young girl as well, before she is hanged, she's raped so that according to their religion, they don't go to heaven. That's the kind of government we're dealing with.
And what do you make of the left wing apologism for the Islamic Republic in the West? I mean, in the UK, we had these extraordinary scenes recently at a supposedly anti fascist rally where people were flying the flag of the Islamic Republic. Given the abhorrent treatment of women that you've just alluded to, given the treatment of other minorities, and just generally the repression of the population, I mean, what the hell is going on there, do you think?
So this is what the Shah of Iran, the previous Shah of Iran, Shahanshah Aryamir, he coined this the unholy alliance between the red and the black. Black being Islamism and red being communism and Marxism and even like the woke far left progressivism type of movement. These various ideologies are united in their anti-Western, anti-America, anti-Israel hatred. So when you see, these leftists, so-called progressive, whatever people, waving the flag of the Islamic regime, that's because they don't actually care about the human rights issues. They've never done. What they care about is this anti-West rhetoric and narrative. That's exactly the same alliance that was happening in Iran prior to 1979, where you had the Islamists join up with the communists and, the woke progressive left all sort of came together to and then, basically they were supported by, France, the UK, and of course, Jimmy Carter and the Democrats to overthrow the Shah and impose a 7th century totalitarian dictatorship. And then, of course, the first thing that happened as soon as the Islamic regime took over is they turned around and they murdered, the communists and the progressives who had been helping them to take power. So the way that I see these leftists is that they're basically just useful idiots for the jihadis. I wish that they would go and, read about the history of Iran, because this is something that we've seen before. And, for us as Iranians, we know exactly how it ends.
And one thing that is very noticeable, if you go to one of the protests against anti-Semitism, for instance, in the UK or the US, you'll see lots of lion and sun flags. The Iranian diaspora Arab force, for that. You'd get a lot of support for Israel among the Iranian diaspora. Um, what is it? A shared understanding of the Islamist threat that you think unites those two groups? Because a lot of the time we're told that everyone from the Middle East must hate Israel, probably anti-Semitic, and clearly this doesn't fit that picture.
There's definitely that shared understanding, of the current, threat of Islamic terrorism and the threat of the Islamic regime, but I think it goes more than that. The Iranian people are indigenous to Iran, and the Israeli people are indigenous to Israel, and, both of us are two very ancient, and great civilizations originating from the Middle East, and, our shared history goes back 2,500 years ago to the time of Cyrus the Great, when he freed the Jews from their Babylonian enslavement, took them back to the Promised Land, and helped them rebuild the Second Temple. And ever since then, Iranians and Israelis, Jewish people, have always had a very close relationship. And in fact, back when the Shah of Iran was still around, both him and his father, Reza Shah the Great, they banned anti-Semitism. And back in, from as of the 1920s up until the 1970s, when Jewish people were being persecuted in other Middle Eastern countries, um, many of them fled to Iran because Iran was a safe place for them. And Iran was where they could live without being persecuted as Jews. It was only when the Islamic regime took over in 1979, imposing their, Islamic Sharia law on all of us, that this rise in anti-Semitism and Jew hatred began. But that uh, Jew hatred, that's not part of our Iranian identity. It's not part of our Iranian culture. It's not who we are. So that whole concept of, blaming Jewish people and hating Israel and all of that, that's a very foreign ideology to the Iranian identity. Because when you look at history, I mean, even like our founding father, Cyrus the Great, respected the Jewish people. And the entire concept of freedom of religion was pretty much invented by Cyrus the Great. And you can find that in the Cyrus cylinder as well.
And would you say you're confident or optimistic that, when this terrible regime finally comes to an end, that Iranian civilization has enough of an identity, enough of a strength to recover from this?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I mean, the the Iranian people, like we as a modern identity, have existed for 3,000 years. So, the Islamic regime has only been around for 47 years. This is, an unfortunate blip in our timeline as, an Iranian people. But we Iranians, like our identity has existed for thousands of years before, the Islamic regime. In fact, thousands of years before even Islam was around. And, we're going to exist for thousands of years after we eradicate the Islamic regime and free our country.
And finally, I just wondered, is there anything you think that people in the West most get wrong about Iran or the Iranian people, or the situation that you find yourselves in?
I would say the biggest thing that people get wrong about Iran is that Iran is not a Muslim country. We're not a Muslim country. Um, and I think people are starting to see that. People are starting to recognize that. We are a proud nation, and we as Iranians, we do not identify with a single religion. We have Iranians of all faiths. We have Iranians who are Muslim, although they are now a much smaller minority. The vast majority of Iranians, I would say, are pretty much atheist or agnostic, but they're, culturally Zoroastrian. And then, of course, we have Zoroastrianism and Christianity. We have Iranian Jews. We have Iranian, atheists, Buddhists, whatever you want to say. And in fact, Christianity right now is the fastest growing religion inside of occupied Iran. but it has to be done in secret because, of course, Sharia law does not allow for the proselytization of any other religion. So that's one of the main things I wanted to say. Um, the second thing I wanted to say is for anyone who's, wondering why should you care about Iran? I would say that the Iranian people's fight to free our country has a direct impact on how much terrorism you're seeing in your countries because the Islamic regime is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism around the world. And so um, I think everyone should have a vested interest in freeing Iran because a free Iran is good not only for the Iranian people, but it's also good for the rest of the world.
Thank you so much for talking to us, Goldie. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time.